Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming back after lunch and after your unconference sessions, and we really appreciate you joining us. And I'd just like to take a moment to give a warm welcome to our special guest this afternoon, FBI Special Agent from the Cyber Unit in Atlanta, Daniel Polk. So Daniel, welcome.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
So I usually start panel sessions and fireside chats with a little fun fact, but I'd like to just ask Daniel to tell us a little bit about where he's been in the last 48 hours, if you are able to do so. I think people would love to hear it.
Sure. Yeah, a little bit of a jet lag. We don't always get to do this. I feel like this is almost unfair. Like I'm pretending like my life is like a Netflix movie when it is absolutely not. I do want to apologize ahead of time for those of you who've seen like FBI shows and you're sizing me up and you think this guy should be at least twice his size, like way bigger, stronger. I was the skinny kid in high school, so alas. But yeah, we just got back from Sydney, Australia, we had a case that was about 1.5 years long. It's unrelated to healthcare, so I'm sorry, but it was on 2 large illicit cryptocurrency mixers. And so I guess maybe why that would matter to you is, God forbid you face some incident with a bunch of like a Russian criminal gang who's trying to, pull off a ransomware or data extortion attack on your data. They're probably going to ask you to pay with cryptocurrency instead of paying with a wire. And that cryptocurrency gets washed several times through these various, illicit mixers. We were able to take the mixers down, and then we were able to stop the 2 Russian guys who were behind it on their way as they were leaving Sydney, Australia, and they were hanging out in the one of the airport lounges and had a rude awakening. So it was a great, successful trip. We had a great time, and Jonathan was kind of giving me a hard time about not answering his emails over the last week. So I was like, I'm sorry, man, I'm literally out of the country right now. But
yeah, that's about the best excuse I've ever heard, and
Tell my wife that.
Yeah. All right, so let's segue in then. So, we've heard now from the good guy. Let's talk a little bit about the bad guys and the types of threat actors that exist.
Yeah, so I do want to make this session as productive as possible. So I think we'll try to save some time at the end for questions, but I do want to kind of just define briefly most of who we'll be talking about today, because I think this second column that you see coming from the left, crime, really this is financially motivated threat actors. These are the primary folks that your teams and the folks who handle legal, cybersecurity, the business side of your operations. I recognize that we have people from all walks of life in the room, different roles and responsibilities. This second column is the one that you guys should be the most alarmed about. Hopefully you sleep well at night, but for those of you who don't sleep well at night, this is, to me, the second column is where we're going to spend most of our time talking about, because it's what keeps me up. The third column, insiders at companies. Think about this in terms of somebody who's disgruntled on their way out the door. They don't have their access to their Outlook web portal turned off, or they might still have access to certain data that could be really harmful to you and your company if it was put in the wrong hands. This isn't always just because they're disgruntled. Sometimes it's because, spoiler, they feel like they're not getting paid enough. It happens to all of us. But countries like China have been very clear in that if they cannot invest in and wait to kind of get the, maybe, let's say, biotechnology that they want to have to compete in that space, then they're going to cheat their way and steal it. And it's economic espionage. And so they recruit these types of insiders and folks at companies who potentially are vulnerable and looking to make a buck. I'm not going to go through the rest of these threat actors here, but for the purposes of today, and I guess I'll also mention hacktivists. I know there's a lot of talk right now in the news about like ideologically motivated attacks, right? And this would be in a case of somebody who is ideologically motivated to attack the healthcare sector in terms of their cyber, resources, their data. So I'll kind of pause there, and Jonathan, if you want to hit on any of that.
No, that's perfect. So, we're going to start diving into now a little bit more specifics about the types of cyber attacks that we experience and we feel in healthcare. Obviously, the Change Health incident, is still pretty raw for a lot of us and fresh in people's minds. A third of all Americans' healthcare data was involved in that incident. But I would like to draw your attention to the one on the bottom. So OCR, Officer Civil Rights, recently settled a case with a healthcare organization who were the victims themselves of a ransomware attack. And so it looks like the days of, pay the ransom and get back to business, are sort of over. So from an OCR perspective, organizations are now starting to be, sanctioned and have to implement corrective action plans as a result of falling victim to ransomware attacks. So we're very concerned, obviously, about the confidentiality of patient information, but I'd like to ask you if you could walk us through, a case study or an example that you've seen, involving, ransomware, for example.
Yeah, before I talk about this photo on the screen behind me, I'll say this, there used to be a code among criminals, honor among thieves, so to say, of they would not attack certain infrastructure of say hospitals or healthcare providers. Those days are gone. The reality is, I think anybody who has a large enough market share including you have the big players of a market share, but you also have the smaller players who maybe they don't invest in cybersecurity, and those end up being I've had many conversations with small mom and pop, whether it's a dental provider or small home healthcare provider who, as you can imagine, they're not going to spend the time and resources to invest a ton in their cybersecurity framework. They end up a target as well because it's just the easiest path to getting some type of extortion request from threat actors. When that happens, we'll kind of have a slide at the end of how the FBI can help. I do want to say we do not report any of our conversations that we have with victims to regulators. That's a different part of the government who deals with a different aspect of accountability. We as investigators within the FBI, our primary job is to help victims and to stop bad guys from re-victimizing additional victims down the line. To also make you aware, if you've been victimized once, chances are you're going to be victimized again and again. It's basically like a bad guy getting a bite of the apple and then trying to pass that apple down to other people within their criminal org to do follow-on attacks. They've spent enough time researching your organization. Oftentimes when they get in, they'll go straight to the employees' onboarding docs that they have stored in, say, a Microsoft SharePoint website that tells a new onboard employee how to make sense of the company, what internal tools are used, what the processes are. And we see threat actors really learning your company better than a lot of your new hires do, because they can use that to try to navigate and continue to escalate their privileges and socially engineer their way into better access. But I just bring this up to go, sometimes there's fear, right, of working with the FBI and concern. I understand why lawyers would, maybe they've heard certain things or they're just fearful that if we report this or we have some conversations beyond our mandatory form that we might fill out, our dirty laundry is going to get aired. And we do not do any of that. We actually have provisions that Congress has given under, again, if you have trouble sleeping at night, just Google CISA 2015, which was an act that basically gives companies and organizations legal coverage to share things like IP addresses that the threat actor might have used or certain vectors that you can share that completely with us and with other even private sector companies out of a defensive standpoint to make sure that more people are not re-victimized. Does that make sense? So I do want to demystify that. As it relates to ransomware, I would also encourage you to reach out to us because threat actors might start asking you, depending on your size, for $10 million, and you have one conversation with us, and we'll tell you, hey, based on our interactions and with all the other victims of your size, they're going to negotiate it down to about $1 million. We'll give you a realistic ballpark answer on what the impact is going to be from a negotiation standpoint. So I would encourage you to pick up that phone call and make a call to us. Yeah, so paying that ransom, I think that's a business case decision, right? I don't want to underestimate the fact that people need to get systems back online. They need to work with customers. They need to deal with that. And so I personally don't think there should be like a blanket size approach of like, we don't negotiate with terrorists, like all the time. I think you have to kind of work through that through your legal counsel, through your business. Do you want to follow up on any of that before I talk about this lovely photo?
So what happened here in the Gwinnett Medical Center case?
Yeah, this was a weird one. This we can talk about this because this the guy pled to this case, and it's now public information. This last year, we shared about this. I work out of the Atlanta field office. Gwinnett is located in the great state of Georgia, and this medical center was hacked because basically, you think about the digital footprint, which is what we're a lot of times worried about, but somebody physically walked into this hospital, plugged in a USB stick to just an available port that they saw open, and they used that USB stick to start scanning the network and see what devices were pinging off of that network, what those devices were updated or not, did they have any vulnerabilities? So like literal physical walk into the hospital, plugging in a dongle and kind of going off to the races. To me, it's an interesting use case because it's a situation where you have both digital and physical security kind of having to meet together. And I know a lot of times like the nerds in the room don't always feel comfortable talking with like maybe the physical jocks in the room who are like maybe on the security side of the house, but I think it's an important conversation of how do you protect the critical information at your company from a physical standpoint as well. Turns out, the spoiler in this case was it was actually a guy in the private sector who'd been trying to sell this hospital a key service, and the hospital was not interested in his services until all of a sudden they got hacked and some of their information started surfacing, and he was like, hey, remember when I told you about this cool product that could keep you from being hacked? Seems like you guys might need this. And we eventually pieced together through some footage and various breadcrumbs that it was that guy who actually hacked them because he wanted business.
Never return to the scene of a crime, right? Isn't that what they say
Never
in the
return to the
movies?
scene of the crime, my guy. Come on, this is rule 101.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the more recent ransomware variants that we've seen out there. Before we dive into Black Bastard, I just wanted to take a moment and maybe ask you two things. One is, can you explain a little bit about these CISO threat briefs? And we're going to use one of these CISO threat briefs as an example to walk through so you can see what's inside them. But also, Black Bastard is ransomware as a service. Can you please tell us what ransomware as a service is and how much it costs and where I might get one?
Oh man, unfortunately, the pay-to-play model has gotten really cheap. With a couple $100s, you could come up with your own kind of customized version of a ransomware variant. It's pretty simple, Jonathan. So if work's not paying well enough, you can essentially go onto the dark web, which isn't as spooky as it sounds. There's just simple browsers you can load up to access a deeper version of the internet. And once there's all kinds of, essentially the old days of one giant, think of it as like a crime family, when we think of like the old school, large, big five crime families in, the Northeast. A lot of that was happening in Russia, where there were these like big crime families that would essentially as syndicates run ransomware operations and, huge complex orgs. That's since changed, where with the internet becoming a little bit more specific, privatized, anonymized, and isolated with various skills, you don't have to learn all of the skills within an organization. Now you can outsource, say, like the initial access to a company. So what we see a lot of times is a ransomware organization might pay $100 for a stolen credential of someone on your sales team, or they might pay $50 for somebody who's, it's a stolen login credential that was just harvested from a big batch of somebody on your employee list happened to click on a site that they shouldn't have been on, or maybe they clicked on a phishing email and they unknowingly gave up that username password, or maybe they installed malware on their computer without realizing it. And that credential, which was pennies on the dollar to the ransomware organization, becomes the digital keys to get into your organization. And then obviously that turns into millions of dollars of extortion. But what you brought up was essentially there are public PSAs that the government puts out to talk about specific things you can be doing, that your IT team can be doing to make sure you're patched, your vulnerabilities are addressed. It's sad to say, but it's kind of like going to the dentist, where every time I go to the dentist, they look at my lower teeth and they're like, hey, have you been flossing? And like, they know the answer. And they're like, you should probably floss more. I'm like, I know, like, we talk about this every time we come in, right? Like, I try, I do my best. When the reality is like, yeah, like, I could make a habit of, there's a system every time I come home or whatever, there's the dental picks. Like, your IT team needs to have a way to access these clear PSAs that give specific indicators of compromise, specific IP addresses that they need to be blacklisting. Every time these PSAs come in, they need to have a system of addressing that. So for those in the room who are not aware, these do get put out, and it's basic, simple cyber hygiene to make sure that you're not massively under the gun in this situation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Great analogy, coming from England where dental care is not necessarily. All right, so they
so I've heard.
Do update these CISO briefs fairly regularly. So the initial access, how the credentials are harvested, is key here. And you can see, from this excerpt that's on the screen, this one was last updated just in November, so very recently. And the mechanisms that the Black Bastard groups are using to harvest credentials has changed, and they're now using email bombing techniques, and also using things like Microsoft Teams, tools that you've already got installed on your laptops and your work machines. So why don't we talk a little bit more about initial access, and you can walk us through some examples, and I've got some screenshots that you provided.
Let's do it. All right, so this next slide. This is like in the timeline of events. This came from one of my cases where the threat actors had socially engineered their way into the company via some phone calls. So they had essentially called the helpline, or they called someone within some department, whether it was sales, HR, and they essentially said, hey, we're with IT. We heard the internet's running slow. There's some people on your team who've filled out some help tickets. And if you've ever dealt with slow internet issues at work, I'm sure that's all of us. It seemed legitimate enough. By the way, threat actors are recruiting females in particular to make these phone calls, Western-based. So it's not going to sound like some Russian dude who's calling you. It's going to sound like a cheerful female. Guys, apparently we just trust women inherently when we get these phone calls. And as this led to the IT worker who's trying to call to fix this situation, he was led to provide, basically right-click on his browser, open up the developer tools, and read off to this person what his active session ID was. And for the non-nerds in the room, this was basically like a special cookie. All your browsers get cookies to make your login process smooth and easy. And once this bad guy had this cookie, he could log in as that person he had on the phone. So he was logged into that person. He starts moving around their network, escalating his privileges, moving around. When I say escalate privileges, it just means he got better and better access, more keys to the kingdom, which is a bad day for that company. They eventually realized that they were under the gun, worked together, kicked this person off. And once they got kicked off, what went through the bad guy's head was, they're probably having some incident response meetings right now, dealing with this particular issue that I caused as the bad guy. And so what he did is he started sending smishing messages, so SMS phishing messages, to all of the employees saying, hey, so-and-so from blankbiotech.com, it was customized to their name. They've invited you to a private Zoom meeting called Incident Response. Please tap this, message to join. And so from there, what they did is use that as a way to refish additional employees to try to, gain new access back into the company. So I say this to go, when you're dealing with critical incidents, this is a time for you to be on guard, to not just assume that, all right, mission accomplished, we kick the guy out of the system. It's contextual. Every time they're thinking through new contextual ways to attack the company. Are you guys tracking with me? So think through that. I recognize that not all of you guys are cybersecurity kind of like leaders in the room, but you might work with those folks. And that's something, if you're dealing with one of those incidents, for you to make sure, A, you're not clicking those phishing links, but B, to be talking through that with your team.
Now that's outstanding, and everyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge proponent of multi-factor authentication, but that in itself is not, a foolproof safeguard. So can you talk to us a little bit about multi-factor authentication and how we need to be, or why we need to be looking at phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication? And I think you have examples here on how MFA can be abused.
Yeah, and look, I recognize you guys are in a unique industry where you don't want a doctor to have to walk into a hospital room and have to badge in, get a text to their phone, or have to do some other like multi-factor if there's an urgent threat to life that they're having to deal with. I get that. I think there are probably core people in your organizations who do need multi-factor authentication absolutely enabled because they hold those digital keys to the kingdom, right? And in that scenario, if you do not have multi-factor authentication, the barrier to entry for the bad guy is incredibly low to get in. If you do have multi-factor authentication, it's not a silver bullet. That's what ultimately this slide is kind of here to remind us. Sometimes we think, okay, I'm good. Like, I don't even know why I'm listening to this FBI guy talk because our company or our organization, we do multi-factor authentication. We're already good, Jonathan. The challenge is threat actors have found ways to socially engineer their way through the multi-factor authentication process. So what you see on the screen behind me, this is actually a phishing website. It's designed to look like multi-factor authentication. So they have a CAPTCHA, check here to prove you're a human process. Second process, you're logging in, username, password. The third process, it kind of hangs. And while it's hanging, saying, give us a second, you can go to the next slide. This is what the bad guy's seeing. They have a Telegram bot set up in the encrypted app called Telegram, and they get alerted, hey, we have a phish on the line. This victim, Jim Bob has filled out username, password, and Jim Bob is waiting for the next, step of the password process. And so the bad guy on the right is clicking, he's actually on the, in the previous case, I believe, is an FCC phishing page. He would be on the FCC actual website trying to log in as Jim Bob. And because there's a real legitimate login as Jim Bob to the FCC website, legitimate real Jim Bob is getting a real code pushed to his phone. You guys tracking with like kind of the process that's happening? So Jim Bob now sees the second factor phishing page on his fake website, and he's sending it back once the bad guy is clicking on his admin panel here on the right, what he needs. So the bad guy has now phished his way through both steps of the process. That's scary to me. Like, that's a bad day because it requires a delicate dance. It's not going to work if Jim Bob, his page is hung up and he's like, whatever, and gets bored and moves on. So it doesn't always work, but it's an important process just to go, MFA is not a silver bullet. It's incredibly important. What do we need here? We need critical thinking. Like, why am I getting this message? Why is it coming from an unknown number? Why is it going to a unique URL that I've never seen before? These kinds of critical thinking processes is what we need to be training ourselves on.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. Of course, once they're in, all the bad things they can do, but they establish persistence. And so have you all seen systems where MFA is configurable, where they allow the user to turn it on or off based on their personal preferences? So once they have got in this one time, they're oftentimes able to then go to the system and configure their app or their widget to turn off multi-factor authentication, change the password, and change the email address associated with that account, and then establish persistence. And that's pretty straightforward and easy for them to do. So once they're in, we talk about privilege escalation and lateral movement, traversing through the network. And it sounds like, again, that would be relatively difficult and would require a high degree of sophistication. And I'm going to ask you, to comment on whether or not that is still the case. And with the use of AI and other tools, how plausible is it for these bad actors to then escalate their privileges and then traverse across networks or throughout the network?
I think if we had this conversation 3 years ago, or maybe even 2 years ago, it would have been probably pretty hard for some of the bad guys. They would have had to be pretty great hands-on keyboard people who understand network infrastructure and architecture to navigate, escalate privileges quickly. You're talking a pretty isolated group of pros. Nation states are really good at that, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea. But we're having this conversation right now, and ChatGPT and some of the amazing, large language learning models, which, I use myself sometimes just to craft better emails and things personally. I don't get to use it on my work computer, it turns out, in case any of my bosses are listening. But with some very simple queries, you can ask ChatGPT about certain core vulnerabilities on a system. You can ask it to explain to you how lateral movement works within a network. You can ask it to help you move up your privileges and your access. And Microsoft and OpenAI have been pretty transparent about the types of queries they've seen from China-based actors, Russian-based actors around this type of model. And it shouldn't come as a shock to us that what AI does is it makes the barrier to entry incredibly small, and it's a force multiplier of we just all get better at our jobs, and that's true for hackers as well. So what we see right now within the FBI, it's not just nation states, it's teenagers in the United States. If you have heard of Scattered Spider, maybe it's for the non-nerds in the room, maybe you heard MGM Grand in Vegas shut down last year for about a week. Casino floors were done. People couldn't log into their hotel rooms or swipe their cards because basically a group of teenagers that go by the name Scattered Spider attacked MGM Grand. And for them, it was a hack of clout. And these teenagers, they grew up playing video games, grew up playing on things like Roblox, and they're really great with their hands on their keyboard. And I think they've gotten really good over the last couple years, probably in large part because there's easy to use tools online that can help you get really good with your keyboard skills really quickly.
I did a little bit of digging not too long ago and read a report that CISO published where they did a red team attack test, so a permitted attack against a federal agency. It was not the FBI, it wasn't the Health and Human Services, and they were all trying to figure out who it was. But they found that successful, valid accounts were used successfully for 41% of their attack vectors. So 41% of their successful attacks were using actual valid credentials that had been issued to real people in the agency. And in 45% of those instances, they were able to escalate the privileges. And then with those escalated privileges, identify other parts of the network. So this is real.
One last note on that, I would say if you hold the digital keys to the kingdom, you've heard me mention that a couple times, I would encourage you to have a phone call or go into your local telecom provider, whether you're a T-Mobile customer, AT&T customer, whoever you are, have a conversation with them or go into your app and ensure that you have the strongest security settings on your app enabled for changing account status for your SIM card. This is an aside, but what we see folks doing from threat actors' perspectives is they'll figure out who has those keys. Maybe you work in IT, and they will go into a T-Mobile store, pretend to be you, and SIM swap your phone. They'll claim to have the latest, greatest iPhone, say that they're having SIM issues, and unknowingly that T-Mobile representative or AT&T representative might swap that SIM to the bad guy's phone, and it's social engineering, and that bad guy is now able to work their way into the kingdom because of that. So if that's you in the room and you have access that's valuable, I would encourage you to at least kind of have that conversation. All the telcos are dealing with this, and they're ready for those types of conversations with you as a customer.
Outstanding. So I'm going to fast forward here a little bit and just go back to the CISO threat brief for Black Basta. So within the threat brief, there is a surprisingly granular level of information that you can see. So in this instance, and again, this is the November the 8th update, they're actually listing IP addresses and domains that are known to be active with this particular variant of ransomware. So, if you subscribe to these, which they're free and they're publicly available, your IT department can look, and they can look for these indicators of compromise and say, oh gosh, you know what? These IP addresses are in our logs. We've got outgoing traffic to these IP addresses. What do? We haven't received a ransomware notice yet, perhaps. So what do we do? And again, and maybe Dan, you could talk to us about this. The criminals are fairly sophisticated in how they get access, and so they're not really at the other end of this IP address, right? They're using VPN networks and proxies.
It'll bounce around for sure. But I would say if you're seeing those IP addresses that came from one of these bulletins, you should jump on the phone immediately with your CISO to kind of have that conversation with them.
The briefs also include recommendations and techniques and things that you can do to help prevent this particular scenario from occurring. All good practices that we all know and love, but maybe you could talk through some of these. This is again from the threat brief that pertained to Black Bastard.
Yeah, I did not write this threat brief. I think it's straightforward. It's some of the things. It's like the dentist office telling you what you need to be doing to make sure that you're not going to have a root canal. It's straightforward. Make sure your systems are updated and patched. Make sure you're applying MFA where you can for those key roles. Training, to me, this third bullet point is the most important one, because you can have the best infrastructure, the best cybersecurity posture. I've seen this happen after company, and the weakest link is humans. Like, we are the weak link. Your IT team did the best job, and yet whoever's monitoring that phone line, who's getting the social engineering call, they're the weakest link. So doing training around these types of calls would be fantastic. And if we can be of help in that in any way, please let me know. You feel free to reach out to me. Jonathan has my information. I'm on LinkedIn, but it's just like we would love to do a training, even if it's remotely, for your company to make sure you're aware of like the types of phone calls people could expect for, say, social engineering.
So that leads us nicely into how can the FBI help? And we'll get through this and then open the thing for questions.
We'll do questions after this. So I'll just say, high level, before an attack happens, I would talk to your executives about these types of training events where you can really test, like, all right, your IT team says they have backups of all your information. If, God forbid, something gets encrypted or locked down, has that IT team tested their backups? Like, actually taken that system on during a downtime and really made sure the backups work? Working through some of these types of questions would help through like a tabletop exercise or through conversations with, the people who plan your incident response. Is notifying law enforcement a part of that plan? Yes or no? Why or why not? We can have that conversation with you before an attack. After an attack happens, I just put this in bold. The moment you know what variant it is, when I say variant, who's the crime family behind the attack? You'll know that based off of the ransom note. Usually they like to claim it. If they don't claim it, we can get a copy of the ransomware note and do a quick check to know it's this group. And we can give you really two things. One, we can tell you what the negotiation's gonna look like what to expect. Two, it might be the best day in your CISO's history when they make that call to the FBI, because we might be sitting on the decryption key. As you can imagine, we do not like to broadcast to the world of which decryption keys we have. These change over time through various groups. And so we don't want to tell a group that, hey, we have the decryptor and we're just giving it out to the people who are getting victimized. So pick up the phone, give us a call, because that's lost revenue that's happening if you don't.
That's fantastic. And we're going to wrap up here with this last slide before we go over to questions. Reporting, there are various mechanisms to report, but can you just tell us a little bit about the field offices, the FBI field offices, and the role that they play and the relationships that we can have with our local FBI field offices?
Yeah, so I just like to say the FBI is a national presence, but it's a local relationship. wherever you're from, wherever you traveled in from, there's going to be an FBI field office probably within close driving distance of you. Those are going to be the folks on the ground that I'm sure would love to build that kind of relationship with you. If you're a part of a company, so I say that first as an individual, as an American. If you or a family member like gets victimized, maybe like a horrible. It sounds horrible to say, but like a lot of like elderly widows and get romance scam calls and might give away tons of money in those calls. Call your local FBI field office. Go to ic3.gov to report that. But if you putting on your corporate hat, wherever your company's headquartered, if that headquarter location does not have a strong relationship with the local FBI office, I would encourage that you guys to pick up the phone, call them, and go ahead and start those relationships now before the bad day comes. CISA, you can reach out to them as well. That site's listed above. The CISA is more there for the proactive. Before a boom goes off, they're there to help to kind of do training, kind of vulnerability like assessments, things like that.
Well, please join me in thanking Daniel for educating us today. It's been a real honor. And we do have some time for questions if folks would like to ask questions. But I thought I saw a hand waving earlier, but it's hard for us to see from here.
Quick question. There was recently a study that was sort of...
Sorry, this microphone coming your way. Right there. Thanks, Adele.
There was just recently a study that came out that showed that the phishing email training didn't work at all, and it was very disappointing because it's what Sutter does. It's like, it seems like it should work. It's what I want my mom to go through. I'm worried about her being phished. Do you guys have evidence that the social engineering training is successful in preventing these attacks, or is it something that we're just adding as a to-do list to make us feel better? Because I was really discouraged by that study.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. So from the data perspective, obviously, I don't run data models to kind of speak to whether or not like the effectiveness of the phishing training versus the social engineering training. What I will say is a lot of the phishing trainings I see when I talk to companies, you look at the phishing emails they send out and you can pick them out pretty easily. There's typos, it's weird kind of grammatical issues, there's strange photos sometimes, and it's like, okay, like we want to pat ourselves on the back to feel like we're doing well. We have strong percentages of all of our employees who are of not having to go to remediation training over an awkward lunch, right? But like, that's not what phishing emails look like anymore when you get spear phished or when you're getting these with ChatGPT. You can go in, I will say this, sorry. I don't want to throw ChatGPT under the bus. There are GPT models or even ways you can kind of jailbreak ChatGPT to have it write a really sophisticated phishing message targeted towards a specific role within the company. That's different than a guy in Western Africa who's, been sending phishing emails to try to like lure a business email compromise type scheme. So I'd push back a little bit on like the trainings are ineffective in the sense that if we're training correctly, I think it's a little bit of a different mindset shift than how we've been doing phishing trainings in the past. Secondly, with social engineering, when I talk to companies who hear these phone calls, it's the first time they've ever heard these phone calls provided to them. Like sometimes companies might do their own internal recordings to know, so-and-so got socially engineered on the phone and we're gonna do a big training for our team on that. Sometimes there's a little shame involved. You don't wanna throw that person who they all know what, Joanne sounds like. They don't wanna throw her under the bus. We blur out the companies, we blur out the victim's, name, and we really try to provide some of these recordings just out of like an awareness, because you'll hear these phone calls and they'll end the call going like, hey, thanks so much. Like, hope you have a blessed day. And you're like, man, like I didn't expect such Southern hospitality like on this call. But like, that's how some of these threat actors are talking because they know how to work that. So to me, that's a valuable training regardless of the metric. Thanks for the ask though. I don't want to add to your to-do list to, guilt trip anyone.
Hi, Anna McAllister. I have a couple of questions, and I will say that this is informed by a really awful, horrible personal hack that I experienced this time last year that was very expensive, super creepy. I'm happy to scare everybody about it in detail if you're interested. But
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
a couple questions related to that. One is, so I reported it to IC3 and got absolutely nothing from FBI and attempted to call FBI and get follow-up. And because they only spent $40,000 on my Amazon account, which was charged to my credit card, that I was told, I live in DC, and I was told that that's not sufficiently large enough for FBI to get involved. So I guess I just wanted to say, is that the case? And B, the hackers got into my stuff, and they ultimately got access to one of my devices and did all sorts of creepy things, but they did it originally through my Amazon account, which they used to charge 40 grand. And there were so many different, I actually wrote an article about it that hasn't run anywhere yet, but they did so many different things. They turned off multi-factor authentication, they turned off purchase notifications. There were a whole long list of things they did that should have triggered even the most basic flag system at Amazon to shut down and to contact me and say, are you the one that's making these weird random gift card purchases? And that didn't happen. And I mean, for me, I felt Amazon made 40 grand off of me, no sweat. My credit card company was insured. I mean, it caused substantial stress for me, but there seems to be zero accountability for the companies who aren't setting up sufficient security alerts. And I'm just wondering if that is an area of interest for FBI. I don't know, maybe that's an FTC issue, but there needs to be some degree of accountability for the companies for not having even the most basic security system set in place to set off alarms.
First, thank you for sharing. I appreciate the bravery. It's incredibly tough to talk about painful experiences like that. And when we meet with victims in our field offices who come in to report, situations like that, to me, it kind of reminds me, we can talk about all these lofty, hacks and big ideas of nation states and all these things. But at the end of the day, you're a person, you matter, and that 40 grand.
I haven't even gotten to the creepy stuff.
And you got creepy stuff. And look, I can't speak to Amazon. I did hear they're right next door, 2 rooms over. So if we do need to go have a conversation with them, let's just walk over. I will be very transparent with you about how the FBI handles IC3 reports like that. To walk you through how it works, you submitted it on IC3. I will encourage anyone who deals with something like this, especially from the corporate side as well, say a business email compromise, immediately put it into IC3, because if it's within 48 hours of say a wire transfer, if we're dealing with, I know this is different than Amazon, but a wire transfer, 9 times out of 10, if it's within a 48-hour window, IC3 is integrated with the banking system where it's going to put a pause and pull those funds back, and you're able to get those funds back to you. That's usually the best thing about IC3. The worst thing about IC3 is the reality is it's going into a funnel where 4,500 complaints a day are coming in. We use AI models to kind of go through and query and pull out quickly what are the most immediate threat to life issues that can be dealt with and delegated quickly to a field office. When you deal with, then let's say it takes, I don't know what the stat is, but let's say it takes a week, 2 weeks for it to matriculate specifically to an FBI agent's inbox who's having to deal with that. That FBI agent, in the case of this Amazon issue that you unfortunately had to deal with, he or she is having to have a conversation with their office and the local U.S. Attorney's Office to figure out what is the bandwidth to kind of deal with this incident. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to check some of the threat actors selectors. So if, in this case, they targeted your Amazon account, if you saw on there that they might have changed your email to a recovery email that was a unique recovery email, that recovery email would be searched within our FBI databases to see if it connects to any other case. If it does, we're cooking with gas, you're connected immediately to whoever that case agent is. There's usually great traction, and you get listed in that case as a victim, and there's usually long-term care and follow-up. If it's not connected to any FBI case, there's a conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office of, does it meet certain financial thresholds based on that district? So in the Northern District of Georgia, thresholds are fairly high. We're talking usually over 500 grand type situations for, depending on whether it's an individual or a company. If it's an individual, maybe if they qualify under some, like maybe it's an elder fraud type situation. You have to think about it from elder fraud is a certain higher level of statutes when it comes to penalties now applied to criminals from a federal level. So if we can't handle it, what usually happens is it gets delegated to state and local police. So what I would encourage you to do, because that process can take some time, is if there was a local police report, I recognize that you might have checked all these boxes and still got no help, in which point I'm really sorry. State and locals sometimes have better charges that they can apply to smaller thresholds that are oftentimes way more productive for you when you are victimized. So I would encourage anyone in the room, if you do deal with any situation, to do both IC3 and do a local police report, because those officers oftentimes are able to affect things quicker than we can. So that's the honest truth and the transparency of it. I'm happy to talk with you or anyone else afterwards to kind of game plan what potential else can be done. But I don't want to lie to say that there's always going to be like an easy solution, because the financial thresholds are unfortunately a part of it, depending on the district you're in and what bandwidth those teams have.
Well, thank you so much for those great encouraging words and all the insights that you've given us. We have to wrap up because we're out of time, sadly. But please thank Dan on our behalf once again. Thank you.